The talk that I'm giving today is based on some arguments that were originally presented in this book, A Legal Theory for Autonomous Artificial Agents. This book puts me in some good company because, like David Hume, like one of David Hume's books, it seems to have fallen stillborn from the press. But I do hope that perhaps I can get more folks to read it. It attempted to develop the outlines of some kind of way of developing an outlines of a legal theory that would deal with some of the challenges that autonomous artificial agents like bots, crawlers, robots, just about anything raise for us. And of course, the sort of sexy sci-fi kind of problem is, civil rights for robots. But we begin with a very mundane problem, which is that programs are used for contract formation all the time on the net. And this is a problem that legal scholars have been thinking about since around 1996, is can a program enter into a contract? Because if you look at the standard legal definition of a contract, it says two parties must intend to enter into a contract. There must be an offer, there must be an acceptance, then the contract is said to be completed. And are these conditions met when things like programs enter into the kinds of transactions that we are used to? For example, when I go to Amazon.com and buy a book. So that's the very mundane starting point that we begin from. All right? And I will get onto that in a minute. Next are going to be some of the obligatory slides that one has to have at a conference like this. Things like, well, there are metaphysical persons. They mark out a kind of entity that's distinct from mere things. Moral persons, legal persons, the subject of legal rights and duties. And this one claim that I'm going to stick to throughout, which is that the grants of personhood that we make, they are not matters of discovery, they are matters of decision. That is, we don't go out and find persons in the world, we go out and decide to elect certain entities as persons because doing so enables very particular social ends and outcomes. That is, grants of personhoods are entirely pragmatic affairs. We do not latch onto an existing metaphysical order of things. We don't find out something about the world. We decide that we are going to treat certain entities as persons. We are a certain sort of creature. We have certain forms of social organization. We decide that certain entities will be persons because we want to do things like, for example, assign blame, agency, and responsibility. And this is where the concept of a person comes from. So I don't think persons are part of the basic ontology of the universe, well, insofar as there's anything such as the basic ontology. But we need them in order to make our best theories of the world work. And so that's why I think grants of personhood are matters of decision. And I'll clarify that a bit more down the line. All right, here's another obligatory slide. Personhood is distinct from humanity. As we've all raised these examples, women, slaves, animals, Martians have all been candidates for personhood. And on the flip side, perhaps sociopaths, psychopaths, and the criminally insane aren't persons. We often have doubts about whether those sorts of entities are persons. Okay, here's the classic identification problem. The identification problem is that we're looking for a set of canonical, necessary, and sufficient conditions that would enable us to identify personhood as distinct from mere things. And the history of the identification debate is that we've had a sort of a bit of failure in identifying any such set of canonical conditions. Allied with the identification problem is something also that philosophers study, which is the re-identification problem, which you would study in a class on personal identity, which is once you have identified a person, how do you identify the same person 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line? Okay, this is a fascinating problem, of course, and you can spend an entire semester doing it and come away with not a very good handle on what enables that. And of course, the borderline and the marginal cases that folks have talked about as well, these continue to perplex us. We're not sure where and when they fall within the boundaries of personhood as far as these conditions are given. But we know we want to treat them as persons because that's the kind of society we are, or that's the kind of society we'd like to be. We treat even these borderline cases as being persons. Typical conditions are cognitive. I notice I'm working with the old version of my slides because I've misspelled Stephen's name out here.
That's right.
Yeah, no, actually my old version has been put up. That's quite all right. I'm not going to switch now. So there's cognitive conditions, there are moral conditions, there are linguistic conditions. Sometimes we worry about displays of intentionality, and Stephen Wise in his book Rattling the Cage did a very good tested these when it comes to things like bonobos and chimpanzees. Sometimes people will throw free will and consciousness into the mix, sometimes rationality. And one of the things that's noticed is that whenever you're having a personhood debate, there's a tendency to run together moral persons and legal persons, and sometimes you might be talking about a legal person and you realize that your interlocutor is actually bringing in conditions that might apply only to moral persons or to, or to a full-blown independent moral person or metaphysical person. Okay, so let's go on and talk a little bit about persons for artificial agents. It's prompted by their autonomy, and one of the claims I'm going to make is that autonomy is not a binary thing. It is not an on and off switch. It is a spectrum. At one end of the autonomy spectrum, you have, I don't know, a stone or a rock or something like that. And at the other end of the autonomy spectrum, perhaps you have a fully blown human being that is autonomous in the Kantian sense. Though it's hard for me to believe that anybody who's read Kant's definition of autonomy would think that any human beings are autonomous in that sense either. And what happens is that when you come up with a contracting problem, one of the solutions for the contracting problem is that you can try and shoehorn artificial agents into existing legal doctrines. You can say, look, there's the so-called unilateral offer doctrine that already exists in law. I stick a coin in a vending machine. The vending machine dispenses a can of Coke. That's it. Contract formed. End of story. Right? And what Lawrence and I found was that most of the solutions that suggest that no changes need to be made to legal doctrine to accommodate artificial agents, they break down when you consider those sorts of artificial agents that are able to devise the terms of the contracts themselves. So one example that is given in the restatement of agency is that, well, look, I have a dog that I sent to the corner to buy some beer for me. And so what I do is that I stick a little piece of paper under the dog's collar and I sort of, give old Rover a pat on the bum and I say, all right, Rover, down to the corner, why don't you come back with a 6-pack of beer for me? And, he's not going to be my agent. He's just a kind of a conveyor of communication. He's just a means of communication. But what if Rover was a smart dog and he was able to make up his mind when he got to the store that, rather than buying the Molson's that's on sale, you might as well buy the Sierra Nevada that's available at a slightly higher price. Then in that case, it's not so clear that Rover is just a means of communication, right? Then perhaps Rover is functioning more like a legal agent. Now, you could suggest legal agent as a way of treating these kinds of entities. But legal agents are also typically legal persons. So would we have to grant them legal personality as well in order to treat them like legal agents? If you're uncomfortable with the idea of granting these entities legal personality, but you still want to treat them as legal agents, you could say, all right, agency, but no personality. Of course, the problem with that is when you do that, as I mentioned yesterday, you're treating them much like slaves were treated in Roman times when they were allowed to go to the market, enter into commercial transactions, but they did not have full legal standing under the jus civile. Right? So they were slaves in that sense. So maybe they could be given a form of dependent legal personality, which is a form of dependent personality not unknown to our legal systems, or you could go on to grant them some form of independent legal personality. And there are a list of conditions that might be suitable for artificial agents to meet before we could grant them independent legal personality. Perhaps you could stress their ability to enter into the formation of contracts. Perhaps their ability to understand and obey the law, their susceptibility to punishment, their being sui juris, that is understanding their legal obligations, or being of sound mind, and so on and so forth. And of course, some of these things sound a bit strange. How could an artificial agent be susceptible to punishment? But of course, the moment you ask that question, what really comes up is that you ask yourself, what is it that you want to do when you want to punish an entity? Do you want to deter that entity from taking the same action again? Are you simply interested in retaliation? Are you interested in modifying that entity's behavior? And it turns out that under some theories of punishment, you could get something that looks like punishing an artificial agent. But of course, that means that the artificial agent would have to have goals that it's interested in, outcomes that it wants to obtain. So the conclusion that Lawrence and I came to was that we don't have artificial agents right now that are capable of being independent legal persons, but a form of dependent legal personality or a form of legal agency that is granted to them without legal personality is certainly possible even under current legal regimes. And of course, what's interesting is that as you sort of go through this as you go through this discussion, you notice once again that some of the claims or some of the some of the features or the capacities that we would like artificial agents to have, or some of those that are opposed to it would like them to have, are those that are associated with model persons. Now, what turns out is that this debate turns into a kind of very familiar sort of dialectic. There's an objection that says artificial agents lack some quality X, which is essential for personhood. And the familiar reply is that as defined, some, many, or all humans seem to lack quality X too. And there are many examples of this that can be given, right? Now, you can give examples of this, and of course, one of the uncomfortable sort of realizations of this debate as you go along is that perhaps the set of conditions that we've been trying to isolate for personhood doesn't really work for us because it's not giving us a good handle on the concept, and perhaps it's blocking us from making certain moves which we might find expedient for us as a society. As I said, I think grants of personhood will be pragmatic more than anything else. Now, the history of personhood jurisprudence is very interesting in this regard. Typically, grants of personhood have been kept limited to resolve a legal issue at hand. That's the way the law works. The law works on a piecemeal basis. It takes the particular issue at hand, and it'll typically say something like, entity X is a person for the purposes of Y. You will never just say entity X is a person, end of story. That will never be said in a court of law. And one of the reasons for this, there's a very nice note published in the Harvard Law Review in 2001, and the reason I don't mention the author is because I don't know who the author is. It's one of these anonymous notes that used to be published in law reviews in years gone by, probably one of the student editors, is that the history of personhood jurisprudence shows that by and large, judges who make personhood decisions are very, very keenly aware of the expressive impact of law. That is, they know that when they are making a grant of personhood, much as we might want to separate legal personhood from model personhood, once you start treating an entity like a legal person, a prima facie case has been made that it has entered the universe of persons, period. And in this sense, judges are often very careful to say something like, our pronouncements in this case should not be understood as applying to any other cases that are not before us, or something like that. It's kind of a standard disclaimer. Or don't take this to apply to other issues that are not present before us at this moment. And this is precisely because grants of personhood might be viewed as endorsement or disapproval. Now, there is the dark side of personhood. And this is an objection that I have often faced when I've even raised the suggestion that artificial agents might be legal persons or persons, which is that the grants of personhood or legal personhood diminish our humanity. We're somehow being disrespectful to human beings by doing this. So for example, corporations are people, right? And there's something very demeaning about this to us. Or we can't take care of human needs, yet we're promoting machines' rights. And of course, the last part, of course, is that by regarding animals as not persons, we are able to continually mistreat and exploit them. So one sort of fact or one point that came up to me when I was working on this chapter was that it struck me that so much of the language that is often used to describe computers and robots is so pejorative in a sense and so reminiscent of terms of abuse that we have used for other entities in the past. For example, imagine using the adjective robotic to describe anything about a human. This can only be understood as an insult. He has a robotic demeanor. He moves like a robot. He, I don't know, he composes songs like a robot. I mean, none of this would remotely be understood as a compliment. You're clearly dissing someone when you're saying something like this. Or say, just a machine, garbage in, garbage out, just a piece of metal, it's a dumb machine. I mean, you only need to read the comments in the New York Times whenever there's an article on AI to look at the immense anger that is present in people about the idea that a machine could be treated in any way like a human. And I think one of the claims I'd like to make is, of course, humans are animals, but I would like to think that we also have a machinic aspect to us. And I think that's, and I don't think calling us machines is a term of abuse. I think it addresses one part of us that perhaps we're not willing to acknowledge as well. Anyway, that's not my central point here. But But what I found was that when you refute arguments against artificial agents' personhoods, you land up rejecting arguments for human uniqueness. Most of these arguments are very chauvinistic. They claim an old-fashioned place for man in nature, which is reminiscent of the great chain of being, which speakers before me have referenced here as well. They flirt with a very problematic religious conception of man. We are unique. We're a singularity in nature. We are possessed of a unique moral capability and a sense which other creatures could not possibly have. How could a machine have feelings and thoughts and emotions and so on? And one of the things that I suggested in the closing chapter was that perhaps what we need is to think about whether two kinds of problems can be solved. Do we have a rich enough relationship with these entities such that the best interpretive framework we have for dealing with them sees us relying on the ascription of a certain very privileged set of beliefs and desires that we ascribe to them? So for example, when we deal with other human beings, we take what many philosophers have called the intentional stance. We ascribe to them beliefs and desires because that is the best way to make sense of their behavior. So for example, when we're dealing with chimpanzees or bonobos, the best way to make sense of their behavior is that this chimpanzee believes that her mother is sitting behind the chair, that is why she did so. Perhaps we ascribe them second-order intentionality. That way we get the best predictive language for their behavior. Could something similar like this happen with machines? And to take it one step further, could we adopt something like the moral stance, right? That is, could we, in interacting with these machines, make best sense of the way they interact with us and our behavior by ascribing them moral beliefs and desires? For example, that robot helped the old lady cross the street because it believes that helping old ladies or old people is a good thing to do, right? So you explain a machine's action by ascribing it certain beliefs and desires. And of course, there's a privileged set of beliefs and desires that I'm calling moral beliefs and desires. And if you find that that is the richest and the most productive framework for you, in preference to a description of its physical innards, in description to its particular inner design, then you have some warrant for describing it as a moral entity. Now, of course, this turns our ascriptions of morality into, perhaps a completely interpretive matter. But perhaps that's a bullet that we need to bite when it comes to those entities whose innards we have absolutely no access to. Okay, so by continuing to treat personhood as a matter for discovery, we simultaneously persist in a futile debate which makes our grants of personhood inconsistent, and it lets us treat other creatures in a moral fashion. And one of the things that I find very suspicious is that many times I think our conception of persons, they look very suspiciously like the free agents of classical market theory. And I wonder sometimes if our conception of persons is somehow over the years just become a kind of a valorization of this notion, right? These freely choosing, very rational, conscious agents, able to pick between different choices. I don't know, they sound just like free market agents to me. Okay, so I would suggest personhood is a pragmatic notion. We recognize persons because doing so enables particular social ends and outcomes. When that time comes with artificial agents, we will do so. I don't think it's going to be a matter of us finding out something about artificial agents. When we are ready for it as a society, when we have entered into rich enough relationships, we'll do it. Lastly, perhaps we should get rid of personhood as a unitary notion. Think of it as a relational matter. There's interesting lessons to be drawn from care ethics in that regard. And in conclusion, I'd say that arguments that reject human uniqueness shouldn't be viewed as being derogatory to humans, but rather as respectful to other kinds of entities and more mindful of our place in nature. Thanks.